We're all familiar with the golden rule. I had to look it up because I kept saying it wrong. Get exactly what it says. So whatsoever you wish that others would do to you, do also to them. For this is the law and the prophets. And since we're studying Exodus, this really relates because Exodus is the law. But a lot of times when we quote that, we're missing the context. You'll see it on slogans, but you always miss the context. Here's the context. If you then who are evil, well, that's a good description, isn't it? Congregation, I want to talk to you who are evil. Raise your hand. No, that's okay. Don't raise your hand. But if you who are evil know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father who is in heaven give good things to those who ask him? The basis for doing good to others is what we have received from God. It's based in the character of God. If we are his children, then we ought to, whatever we wish others to do to us, we must do to them. Treat others like you want to be treated. That's a good rule, because that's how God treats you. We're gathering today. This is the first Sunday of the month, and is our custom on the first Sunday of the month, we observe the table, which is a reminder to us of God's mercy to helpless people, us. It's the table of those who've been oppressed in body and spirit. Remember, it looks back to Egypt and the oppression that was there in Egypt, and God brought his children out of Egypt, out of that slavery. It was on the first night of their deliverance that this Passover, this table, was instituted as a reminder to them to recognize that the death angel passed over their homes because he saw the blood on the doorpost. And when I see the blood, I will pass over you. That's where the name Passover comes to us. This meal we will participate in today is a reminder of that Passover, that God has been merciful to us. God hears the cry of the oppressed. And I have exercised my prerogative to select out of our this week's study passage, Exodus 22, 16 to 31, three groups of people that I want to talk about today. They're dealt with, and their treatment lies around this concept of the golden rule, how you treat others the way you want them to be done. And I believe they're test groups. I think God puts people like this in our life so we can exercise, practice, have a lab experience, an education, however you want to put it, whatever term works for you, in how do you live out the mercy of God amongst other people. The first group that he talks about are the foreigners in verse 21. The second group are the widows and orphans in verses 22 to 24. And then finally, he's going to talk to us about the needy in verses 25 to 27. And those are the verses I want to deal with today. All the other stuff in the passage I've already talked about with our Sunday school teachers, and you'll be discussing that, working on that this week, and they'll lead you in a discussion of how those things work. But I primarily want to deal with these few verses here, 7 of them, that I want us to deal with in this regard. It talks about God hearing them when they cry out. I want you to understand that that is not put here in this text to be an encouragement to the suffering. That might be a proper application of this, but that's not the point of this passage. The point is, it is a warning to people who would oppress other people. As we read through, as we think through this passage, you're going to see that God wants to warn us that we will not do that. Well, let's think about the foreigner, first of all. Verse 21 talks about that. What do you have in a foreigner? Well, a foreigner is somebody who is very disadvantaged in a society economically. Particularly think about Israel as they were going to be going in that. A foreigner would lack any inherited land. You can't own land. You don't have any land that you own there. And in an agricultural-based economy, if you don't have a farm, it's real tough to be a farmer. Anybody in the FFA? Ever been in the FFA? Future Farmers of America? It's a lot easier to be in the FFA if you have a farm. It was really tough on guys and gals that didn't have a farm for them to practice on it. You got to raise something. You got to do something. And most parents do not take kindly to hog farming in the bedroom. That just doesn't work. Growing tobacco in the front yard. No, that doesn't really work too well. You've got to have a farm. And these folks didn't have a farm. They didn't not only have a farm, but they didn't have any kinship. They didn't have anybody that they could turn to and say, hey, I need some help. And they would say, sure, you're my kinsman. I'll help you. I'm your cousin. I'm your uncle. I'll help you. You know, around here, you guys, everybody knows everybody here is interwoven. I think everybody here is kin to everybody else. Probably no more than a third cousin away. I have heard of fourth cousins here. Well, what's amazing is people know that's my fourth cousin. You know, that's my fourth cousin. He's so, and they know the whole connection. There's that connection that you have, that big network of family that you can go to and you draw upon, and you know all of these people, and they help you and you help them. There's that kin. A foreigner doesn't have that. They got nobody. All their family is somewhere else. Many times they're here and they're the only ones that are here. When you don't have the means to economically survive and you don't have the kinship, you are going to suffer when you go to a new place. It's going to be tough. That's why he says in verse 21, he says, you must not mistreat or oppress foreigners in any way. And then he says, remember, you yourselves were once foreigners in the land of Egypt. Well, I got to thinking, how might somebody oppress or mistreat a foreigner? Well, let's think back. He says, remember you were in Egypt? They immediately had the experience of going back, as we can do, in chapter 1 and noting how they were mistreated as slaves. First of all, they were enslaved when they had formerly been free people. And all of a sudden, they lost ground. And many times that's what happens when a person slides into poverty, is they lose ground. And pretty soon you get to a situation where your next choice is going to be impoverished in a hole you probably never will dig out of. Well, when the Egyptians made the Israelites, the children of Israel, slaves, well, these had been free people. These had been privileged people in Egypt. Now they're taking them all the way down, and you're going to be slaves. You're going to serve us. You will be mistreated in this regard. They beat them. They forced them to work hard. They even tried to kill their children. Well, that's kind of rough. I would take umbrage to that. Wouldn't you? Some of you obviously have one or two that you think maybe if, I got one, I might, this week there might be one. That maybe not next week, but this week I would take exception. No, it's like when you're oppressed, when you're in that kind of situation that you can't dig yourself out of, you've been put in a situation, all you can do is go deeper and deeper into debt or deeper and deeper into slavery. And then they're subtly trying to kill off your children. And finally, when that doesn't work, let's do it out openly. And they were actually taking babies by the heels and flinging them out into the Nile River. And you're thinking, wow, that's real oppression. It's amazing to me that anybody that ever been through that would then turn around and have to be told, don't oppress foreigners who come into your midst. But many times, when you get something worked out, okay, I'm no longer a slave, now I'm never going back that way. And you as a foreigner are a threat to me. And so many times you have to remind folks, look, you got to remember where God brought you from. You were somebody that was totally alienated in a country. You understand what it's like to come into a place and be the odd person out. What was Israel to give the foreigners? Because remember, it's doing unto others. Actively, they were, first of all, to give them the great blessing of Israel, Sabbath, a day of rest. You know what I'm talking about? Sabbath, a day where you can just rest. Some of y'all don't know that. Don't have any idea. You guys that work shutdowns, you understand what's missing when you don't have Sabbath, when you don't have a day off. It's kind of like you get crazy because, man, there's no day off. There's no day of rest. And then when you recognize, okay, as a normal person now, I can take a day and rest. Imagine being able to say, well, you're a foreigner, you're a slave. Many times a lot of these foreigners were slaves. They were purchased as slaves. Or they became slaves. They had to sell themselves in order just to survive in the nation, to be with God's people. They would do that. And the blessing of having one whole day off where you're not supposed to do anything except rest. That was one of the great blessings God gave Israel coming out of Egypt. You get a Sabbath rest. I want you to take one whole day. Your food will last. It won't spoil. I'll take care of you for one whole day. You get a whole day of rest. That's a great blessing to give to other people. Furthermore, it says in chapter 12, verse 48, that they could observe the Passover and worship with Israel. They were allowed to do that. They were allowed to remember as though they had been there in Egypt. They were able to participate in the worship and to find out about that when God sees the blood, that God provided life. God let us go on and live. God has poured out his blessing. God has been doing these things. We can participate in worship. A non-Israelite, a foreigner, I think the word here, if I remember right, it's the word gar, but I'm probably not pronouncing that right because I've been influenced by fish. But it's the idea of that somebody's really far, but they could come and they could offer a sacrifice at the tabernacle through the priest. They were permitted to be involved in the worship, to be able to worship the one true God, who is the God of mercy. Remember, he's the God of mercy, and they were able to learn about that. They also were to make provision for the foreigner, and this comes through the gleanings. When they would harvest their field, they weren't to cut the corners, and if you dropped something, say you're cutting along and some of it drops out, you don't pick it up, you just leave it. And then those who don't have land can come in and they can glean after you. And you were to leave some provision for them. Furthermore, it says in Leviticus, they were to support the foreigner. They were to help them out by giving them money because they don't have money. So they were actually to make provision. They were actually to support them with money. It says they're just as you would a fellow Israelite who fell into hard times. It's almost like these foreigners are now the equal of the Israelites. They were also to provide the foreigner with protection under their laws. In those days, murder called for vengeance of blood. You had an avenger of blood. You had a relative, a blood relative, whose job it was to kill the person that killed you. And Israel, God said, I'm going to set this up when you get into the land. I want you to set up, remember those 6 cities of refuge? Where a person who has killed somebody accidentally, they've done something, this person died, it was an accident, they can flee to that city and they won't be killed until they've had a chance for a trial. And if they're found to be innocent, they can live on in that city till the high priest dies. He said you're to extend that protection to foreigners. That tells me the laws ought to apply to the Israelite. They also apply to the foreigner. You can live under the same law and you'll have the same protection under the law. In fact, in Deuteronomy 27:19, one of the curses was they cursed those who denied the foreigner justice. If you wanted to get cursed in Israel, want to be under that curse, well, mistreat the foreigner, and you would be under the curse of God. The law is stretching towards those who are foreigners. And so, by application, let's think about this. How do you treat non-Americans who live in our area? That's a question we all have to ask ourselves. When you see somebody that looks foreign, they're not from here. As a foreigner, I have appreciated a great welcome in Cajun country. I knew some Cajuns, and that sort of got me in. I found out if you know somebody, if you know one, and you're in with one, they get you in with everybody. And then if you don't mess up, you don't get on the outs. But how do we do? There are people all around. I mean, you see people in the grocery store. They don't speak English. They don't look like us. They don't act like us. And you say, they're not from here, are they? They're somewhere else. And then they talk, and they don't have this pure Louisiana accent like I have. Or like some of you had. They don't talk like people in Morgan City that I sat around and listened to. So I thought, I got to listen. I got to hear some of this. This is great. How do we treat them? If we understand God's mercy, it means we should be merciful to them. Why? Because, now listen, this is the whole point. Don't miss this point. I'm just about to tell you the whole point of this thing. You're on this earth to represent God. Remember, you were created in the image and likeness of God, and then sin messed all that up. It marred, it totally depraved every aspect of our life. Every part of our life, that's what total depravity means. Every aspect of our life has been marred by sin. It has been brought from what it was in perfection, down to something that doesn't even always look like the original. In salvation, God says, I'm going to put my spirit in you, and I'm going to make you to be a fit image and likeness of me upon the earth. That's what's happening in our life. That's what God is gradually doing. As we encounter the Word, as we listen to what God is saying, as we start to obey God, God is saying, I'm going to make you like me. So when we are treating foreigners, non-Americans in our case, what God is saying, you are representing me in your interaction with them. They're going to see me in you. There are plenty of people that mistreat foreigners, all kinds of ways. Some of those we just mentioned, just to get you started as you're going through those and thinking through those. By the way, that's in your bulletin. You can look up those passages and read those and get more gleanings. I've left some gleanings there. So when you go in there and glean, there's plenty more in there to read through around that. But we're to represent God. You've heard it said, that you're the Bible that most people who don't read the Bible will read, something along that line. You're the first introduction to the Bible for most people. What does it mean to be a Christian that follows the Bible? We've heard a lot of Christians, but what does it mean to be a Christian that takes the Word of God and says, okay, how do I live that out? Well, not maybe. We don't do it perfectly, but we ought to do it improvingly. That we're learning how to do that so that they can begin to see, oh, that's different from the Christians I heard about or the Christians I've met. There's something different about this person and the way they live, the way they treat me. They treat me differently. The second group that God brings into everyone's life are widows and orphans. I got to thinking, well, how might a widow be oppressed? I mean, just the fact of being a widow is bad enough, but to have oppression on top of that. And I got to finding some things in here where it talks about. One of them, and this is one that we don't hear about very often, you've heard of the tithe? Well, every third year, they were to take a tithe of everything they grew and put it in a storehouse in their local area to be given out to the foreigners and widows and orphans and priests and those who were poor. And he's saying sometimes when you don't do that, when you don't give them that tithe for the poor, when you don't share what God has blessed you with, that's oppressing other people. If you're not taking what God has given you and sharing that with other people, taking a portion of that and using it to bless other people, you're oppressing somebody that you ought to be helping. You're exploiting them instead of helping them. That's Deuteronomy 14, 28 and 20. I'm going to take time to read that this morning. The second thing people did, and it's amazing to me that people did this, they would accept a widow's garment as security for a debt. I'll loan you money, but I've got to have your cloak, madam. Deuteronomy 24:17 says this, true justice must be given to foreigners living among you and to orphans. You must never accept a widow's garment as security for her debt. You know why that's in there? They were doing it. All of these specific laws, don't do that. Somebody was doing that and said, well, that's kind of what I need to do. Failing to leave gleanings for a widow. Deuteronomy chapter 24, verses 19 to 21 talks about that. It said, when you beat the olives from your olive trees, don't go over the boughs twice. Leave the remaining olives for the foreigners and orphans and widows. Everything, your grapes, your crops, everything, leave some for everybody else that doesn't have the ability to do as well as you are. Well, okay, we want to leave, want to be generous for that. We want to do those things. We don't want to take their cloak. We don't want to oppress them by not sharing. Are you looking out for the widow? Job, his friends were trying to help him figure out why God had turned against him, even though God hadn't. Why were things going wrong in your life? And they said, you've probably failed to help a widow or orphan in their need. They said, you must have sent widows away empty-handed and crushed the hopes of orphans. Well, turn that around and think about it. What was the standard? If somebody is a widow, woman's a widow, she's got orphan children, they're looking to you to help. They're really hoping that you'll help them. Every now and then, we get travelers coming through, and we get a knock on the door, and they're looking for help. A lot of times they're looking for gas money to go down the road or something of that nature, and so we try to help out anybody that we can. But when they're knocking on the door, what are they looking for? Help. They're looking for somebody to help them some way, somehow. When you encounter people that are in need, when you know that widows and orphans have needs. When they have those needs, they're coming to you and they're really hoping. A lot of times they're not asking, but they're really hoping that you're going to help them. Job 24:3. Well, let me just read the verse. You can put that up. They take the orphan's donkey and demand the widow's ox as security for a loan. I mean, one thing to take a widow's cloak, but here you got this widow. Her farmer husband has died, and now you're going to take her tractor as collateral for a loan. Or to put it in our terms, I'll loan you the money to make your house payment, but I need your car keys. Well, how's she going to get to work? How's she going to get the kids to school if you take her car as collateral for loan? When we practice things like that, or when we don't think about some of the things that we're doing, some of the things that we're doing are driving people into poverty instead of helping them out. You're forcing people to go further and further into debt because we're not helping them out in their need. We're not saying, well, I'm just going to give you some money. Some people would cheat a widow. Isaiah 10:2 talks about They deprive the poor of justice and deny the rights of the needy among my people. They prey on widows and take advantage of orphans. There are some people, I don't know who they are in this community, but I'm almost confident there's some people in this community that look upon widows and orphans as the way they make their daily bread. My job is to pray on them. Let me give you an example that I think we'll all understand in that regard. Anybody ever go through a flood or hurricane? Do you ever hear about people that come in and I'm going to fix you up? Looters, yeah. Well, I'm talking about looters. I'm talking about just regular, ordinary crooks that are going to come in and they will say, hey, we will fix your flood damage up. We'll help you do this. Sign this contract. We need money. And then they take the contract and the money, and that's the last you see of them. There are contractors, so-called. That's how they make their living all over the country. There are actually people, that's how they make their living. They go to an area where people are in difficulty. They look the part. They look like contractors. They look like people know what they're doing. They might actually even do a little something. But that's the last. Once they get the money they're going to get, they're not going to do the rest of it. They're taking that money and running and leaving you where you are. There are people in this country, I am confident, I don't know any of them. Chris knows one of the reasons I guess I don't know them because I come from part of the country where he needed killing is a good excuse for some folks. I mean, that's a viable defense. Some of these folks need killing. They need beating or something. They need to be, because when they find a widow or an orphan, they see business opportunity. Here's an opportunity for me. Do you realize that there are people in some places in this country, I don't think down here, that when you have a funeral, somebody has to stay at the house? Nope. They actually you have to have somebody, they did in Memphis, you had to have somebody stay at the house because if you don't, they know when you're gone for the funeral and people will break into your house. They had it back here too. The problem was, it was God's people doing it. And they rationalized, I got to feed my family. And that's how I make a living. And God is addressing, you can't do that because you're supposed to be taking the role of defending the widow and orphan. Isaiah 1:17 says this, learn to do good, seek justice, help the oppressed, defend the cause of the orphan, defend the cause of the orphan, fight for the rights of widows. You know why you do that? Because Psalm 68:5 declares clearly, it says, he is a father to the fatherless, defender of widows. This is God whose dwelling is holy. If you're going to represent God, look for the underdog. Look for the widow and orphan that you can help. Because God says that's my role. And since you're representing me, that's your role too. In the New Testament, it talks about we need to visit widows and orphans. We need to look for people that we can help. Because generally as we live pretty insulated. And if you don't go looking, if you don't go visiting, you won't see that there's a need that you can meet. If you want to be like God, help widows and orphans. Why do people do that? Why do they mistreat widows and orphans? I think it's because they figure there's very little a widow and orphan can do about this. If I cheat them, I live somewhere else. I'll write up a contract, I'm gone. What are they going to do, appeal to a judge? Maybe some neighbors are, but what's this woman going to do to me? But God says there are consequences. God hears their cry, and it makes him angry. The word that's used there was the flaring of the nostril and where your nose got red. You could see it in the face. If God had a face, you could see God on the slow boil. And that's what he's trying to convey here. God says, I am going to address this issue. I will do it. I want you to do it, but if you don't do it, don't worry about it because I am going to do it. I'm going to take the people who did this horrible thing. And God says very poetically, I'm going to kill you. He says it nicer than that. He says, your wives will be widows and your children fatherless. But that's what he's saying. If you treat widows and orphans like this, I'm going to kill you. And God can not only kill you now, he can kill you forever. As Christians, it is part of our job to care for widows and orphans. James 1:27 says this, pure and genuine religion in the sight of God the Father means caring for orphans and widows in their distress and refusing to let the world corrupt you. The early church cared for widows. In fact, the Apostle Paul wrote in 1 Timothy chapter 5 almost a whole chapter on how to do this, how to go about taking care of who was responsible, who was supposed to do it, and if they didn't do it, who else was to do it. Let me come quickly to the third group that he mentions here. Third test case you're going to encounter in this world, and that's needy people. Who are the needy that he's talking about? We've talked about foreigners, so he's not talking about them. Talked about widows and orphans. Who are we talking about here? He said, well, the needy among you as believers. My people. Talking about our fellow Hebrews there. When there are people among you, in particular, Hebrew men, who are falling in hard times. Now, how do you know who these people are? Well, one thing is in the text here. He needs to borrow money. He says, if you lend money to any of my people who are in need. In those days, if you needed to borrow money, you were seriously in need. Today, a lot of farmers got in trouble because they had to borrow money, or they borrowed money to go big or go home, and they lost their home because they went big and they couldn't pay the debt off. In those days, you didn't borrow money to put in a crop unless you really were in bad way or you really needed something. These folks, one of the things is they were needing to borrow money. Now, why did they need to borrow money? God says, I'm going to provide for you. He says in Deuteronomy 15:4, there should be no poor among you, for the Lord your God will greatly bless you in the land he is giving you as a possession. God says, I'm going to bless you. I'm going to give you a piece of ground, and I'm going to bless you. I'm going to bring the rain. I'm going to do the things that are necessary for you to be blessed. You got your own place. You can grow your own food. You can build your own home. You can raise your family there. And there'll be other places you can get. And you'll be able to expand and do the things you need to do, and you'll be able to live in the land and provide. Everybody will be able to provide for themselves. It's the greatest system in the world. You're not going to have that problem if you're working. I have a friend of mine that had a concrete business, sold concrete, had guys that would drive. He said, I thought it was this great insight. He said, if I've got somebody working for me and they're working 60 hours a week and they're not able to make it, he said, that's my problem. I'm obviously not paying them enough. But he said if they're not working 60 hours a week and they're not able to make it, that's their problem. They're not working hard enough. There are going to be people that aren't going to make it. God goes on to say in verse 11 of that same chapter, he said, there will always be some in the land who are poor. Well, shucks, I thought we were going to cure poverty. No matter what we do, there's always going to be poor people in Luling or St. Charles Parish. Maybe not in Luling, but in St. Charles Parish, there's going to be people that are poor. And he said, that's why I'm commanding you to share freely with the poor and with other Israelites in need. Another mark of extreme poverty, and this is how bad it can get, is found in Deuteronomy chapter 24, verses 14 and 15. I think that's coming up okay. Never take advantage of poor and destitute laborers, whether they are fellow Israelites or foreigners live in your town. You must pay them their wages each day before sunset because they are poor and counting on it. You know what he's saying there? Guy goes to work. He's expecting his pay that day because he didn't have money to buy food. He's living from day to day. They're day laborers. If I get work and I make money and I get paid, we can go out and buy stuff to eat tonight. If I don't, we'll go hungry. That's poor. That's an impoverished condition that somebody is in. He said, these are the kind of people. They may only have one asset to their name. That's how poor some of these folks are. He says, all he's got is his cloak or blanket. And his cloak may be his blanket. This is what he wraps up in at night to knock the chill off. I don't know about you, but I can't hardly sleep without something on. A blanket or something. It just feels good to have that. It feels good. And, when it gets cool like this, cold, it's nice to have a blanket. Can you imagine if you had that out on in order to get money to buy food? I had to give up my blanket, and he's lying there at night. And God says, if you don't give him his blanket back before nightfall, they might cry out to the Lord against you, and it would be counted against you as sin. God, you're that serious about it? It's a sin? Christ had to die for that? Yeah, it's that kind of sin. Why do we help these people out? Because we are imitating God. And we have learned from God that he has been merciful to us. It's not a more helpless bunch of people than we were before we became Christians. There was absolutely nothing we could do to pay for our sins. We couldn't take care of original sins. We couldn't take care of yesterday's sins. There was nothing we could do. We couldn't even stop sinning. We couldn't even think right about things. And there was absolutely nothing we could do to pay off our sins. Now, that's in a hopeless, helpless situation. I hope financially you're not in that point to where you don't see there's any way I could pay off the debt I've got. But if you are, you understand spiritually where we've all been. we all came to recognize I can't pay anything. I don't have anything to offer God that would make up for not being what he wants me to be in this world. Not a thing. I can't even turn over a new leaf and pay off any of my old sins. The best I can do is just keep from doing wrong again. I'll try to do better today. Maybe I will help a widow out with a need, or maybe I'll help somebody that's a foreigner out with a need. But that doesn't pay anything off. That just says this is what I'm supposed to be doing anyway. And we were helpless and hopelessly in debt. But God is merciful. And that's the reason you're here today. And the only reason you're here today. That's what this table reminds us of. If Christ had not come and died in our place, none of us would have any claim on God, and God would have no obligation to us whatsoever. We're here simply and solely because God has been merciful to us. Why should we be merciful? Because God was merciful in giving his Son. John 3:16, for God so loved his own people, right? No, so loved the world that he gave his only Son, the only one he had, his only begotten Son, that whosoever believes in him should not perish, but have eternal life. I went from certainly to die to certainly never to die in an instant because God was merciful in his love. As we observe the table today, we are testifying, reminding ourselves and testifying to you who have come today. That's the only reason we have any relationship with God at all, because of what Christ did on the cross.